Well, you look reasonably sane. I am a knight of Katarina. I've managed to track down this cathedral's store of treasure. It's right over there, across that narrow part. Treasure? Always so close, yet so far. I'm in quite a pickle, indeed. Just hold your horses a moment. I know. Treasure is so sorely tempting.
Shame on you, you greedy guts. Thought you could outwit an onion. Well, say hello to the nice giant. He adores visitors.
Once again, we're grasping the souls that we've painstakingly acquired through endless rolls, poise abuse, powering Dad's belt, and more amalgamations of pain and misery in the Souls world. The Dark Souls franchise has become one of the most influential and impactful action RPG games in recent years, providing a display of challenging but rewarding combat that has now become a powerhouse in the AAA scene. Dark Souls 1 wasn't the first, but it was certainly the game to form the identity of Souls games, or Souls-likes, that would come later. Demon's Souls would provide the bones needed for Dark Souls to flourish and create a new genre of its own due to its sheer success. Dark Souls 2 was the game in the trilogy to do something different, staving off from the first game and doing something of its own, creating its own identity, for better or worse. It's also generally considered to be the worst of the bunch, and is also the most divisive one. The ones that love it truly do, while everyone else complains about adaptability. But Dark Souls 3 would not only be the fitting end to an amazing trilogy, but would also being what I think is ultimately the best one in the whole trilogy. The first one used to be my favorite because of how it impacted me and how it affected my views towards gaming at the time, but the game nowadays is really starting to show its age and has a lot more glaring problems than people would like to admit. And because of both Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, it's become much harder for me to go back to playing Dark Souls without it feeling like a huge downgrade. Dark Souls 3 is a more refined and consistent experience across the board when it comes to PvE content, the feeling of combat, as well as having the best boss fights in the entire trilogy. The years of Souls development has culminated in a final piece of the puzzle that hammers down the nail in the coffin one more time for the sake of sending the series out into the ashen wasteland that it has now become. After playing through Bloodborne, which is still my favorite From Software game to this day, I had the same expectation of quality for Dark Souls 3, and with Miyazaki taking the helm once again, there was confidence in there being a more direct sequel this time around rather than what we got in Dark Souls 2. Since this was the last one, it was important to take one story and wrap it up with a satisfying conclusion in Dark Souls 3, and that's what happened. We got a vastly superior sequel with lots of callbacks to the first, a mix of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1's combat going into a blender. So, let's get into it now. So, as you can tell by the state of the world in this game and the limited variety of colour, things are now worse than they've ever been. The events and cycles of 1 and 2 have gradually torn the world apart, so much so that the world is more or less coming to an end, and yet we're still expected to kindle the first flame once again in order to keep the Age of Fire going on as usual. Once again, we play as another pawn in the long and drawn out game of Fire and Dark, except this time things are a little bit different. For starters, our character is unique from the Chosen Undead and the Bearer of the Curse from the previous games. Instead of going hollow and looking ugly as shit, we get to keep our human forms for the first time. Why is this the case? Well, we're not just undead in this game, but we are unkindled. And what is an unkindled? Well, they're sort of like the chosen undead that tried to link the first flame, but didn't level up their adaptability high enough and turned to ash as a result. Over time, we would rise from our grave and would be called upon once again to more or less do the same thing. Part of that requirement is to defeat the Lords of Cinder and return them to their thrones, and this becomes the main objective for the entire game. And in Dark Souls fashion, we do this by dying over and over again until we conquer the areas and the bosses that occupy them. With the help of the Firekeeper and a massively watered down version of the Nexus from Demon Souls, we level up, talk to NPCs, acquire new gear, upgrade with shards and gems, acquire spells, and find new NPCs to take back to Firelink Shrine, the game's hub area basically, except this time it's separate from all the other areas of the game while still being in the same region. For those that have already played through the Dark Souls games, it's more or less the same deal here. Once you've played one, the skills acquired from that game more or less carry over, and the only things that you have to deal with are new mechanics, enemies and bosses, new areas, as well as finding ways to discover other items and other types of Easter eggs or hidden bits of lore. The rest is just quick adaptation. But for newcomers, it's actually one of the easier games to get into because of the more linear sense of progression in comparison to 1 and 2, and the gameplay is a lot more snappy and refined. Most of the time, it's generally best to start with the first game, and in the case of playing Dark Souls 3, playing the other two will give you a much deeper appreciation for what 3 brings to the table. 3 feels a lot more focused this time, with rolling back to the first game's story, as well as bringing back the similar combat system that we had in the first game. Bloodborne has also had an impact on this game, and it's reflected in the overall speed of the game, but we'll get to that a bit later on. In terms of the story and the world, it's very rich and interesting, just like the other two, but when you combine it with 1, it's even more impactful overall because of similar people, items, enemies, and locations too. Dark Souls 3's world is a complete contrast to the first one. Everything went to shit in the first game as well as the second, but the worlds in those games still seemed somewhat healthy with its lush colours and variety of scenery. In Dark Souls 3 though, it's the complete opposite. Everything in this game is run down, tired, and deathly. The colour of the world is being sapped away because the endless cycles have gone on for so long that it's tearing everything apart. On the one hand, it's disappointing that we don't get the same amount of variety of strikingly different locations like we get in Dark Souls 1 and 2, but at the same time, it's the most thematically consistent of the bunch. The theme of things fading away and things coming to an end is seen in every orifice of the Dark Souls 3 world. Even when you get to Irithyll or the Ring City, it becomes apparent that this is as colourful as it's ever going to get because again, things are still coming to an end whether you like it or not. Collectively, the world and its consistent tone of colours makes it into more of a large growth of crumbling kingdoms and dying pockets of nature rather than a sprawling region with dynamic biomes and areas like in Dark Souls 2. Going from Hirewall of Lothric all the way to Irithyll makes for a lot of similar but interesting locations still because of the differences in their atmosphere as well as the backstories for each area. I personally preferred the more lifelike regions of Dark Souls 1 and 2. Same goes for what we see in Elden Ring, but thematically it makes more sense for Dark Souls 3 to go for a more ruined and apocalyptic setting due to its own unique themes. In saying that, the level design is really good in 3. It appears to be more linear due to places being a lot closer or easier to navigate. In 3, I never really felt lost in terms of where I had to go. The levels felt more or less like a straight line with some forks in between, but those same forks will eventually lead you back to the same fork anyways. For instance, when you clear Cathedral of the Deep, you get an important item that you'll need to use later. You can't go any further. Okay then, you go back to the Road of Sacrifices, where the Exile Knights are, and that'll lead you to Farron Keep, a swampy hellhole with annoying enemies and a surprising enemy from the first game, and there'll be more of that too. The point is that the game is easier to navigate, but it makes up for it by having a lot of interesting areas while tonally they're very similar, but also have a lot to discover, and there's also quite a lot of interesting sort of Easter eggs, things that you'll pick up on if you've played Dark Souls 1 and 2. To elaborate, in spite of the simpler pathfinding in Dark Souls 3, the areas, as I've already said, are still packed with a ton of detail, as well as having a lot of environmental storytelling to show for it. Lothric is the large kingdom that has suffered the same fate as countless other kingdoms. Cathedral of the Deep is a place of religious fervor and annoying midgets, but that area in particular is so well designed that every area in that level eventually goes back to the first bonfire that you discover. A lot of the areas have their own unique challenges that you have to account for. Like before, going in too quickly can lead to reckless deaths, especially if you don't know what the unknowns are. And since the combat is faster than before, it can be easier to be overwhelmed with enemies that have Bloodborne syndrome. Speaking of the combat, it's like Dark Souls 1 but more polished, and the speed of it has been increased significantly. Enemies attack much faster and harder than before. Your character also has the means to respond quickly too, thanks to a new ability called Weapon Arts. Basically, the weapons have a unique attack ability that gives you a unique way of attacking. Some weapons have other added effects and new animations too, but its presence adds another dynamic to the already great combat system that Dark Souls 3 has. Every time you use it, you spend focus points, which has replaced the previous system that magic users have enjoyed in 1 and 2. And with that addition, you can also use a different type of Estus flask that replenishes those focus points. Those points are used for weapon arts as well as using spells. Depending on your build, you'll want to make that bar go up about the same as your health. But since I usually go for pure strength or dex builds, I never really touch it. The game's speed could either be a non-issue or a potential hindrance depending on your build. You no longer have the slower and more methodical combat like you do in Dark Souls 2, but something that is a mix of Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne, which means that you need to respond fast and quickly this time. A lot of the enemies in Dark Souls 3 can hit you in the blink of an eye. They have a lot more combos, as well as having delayed attacks and a tendency to punish you when healing too close. Whenever I play a dex build, I feel like I'm playing at the game's intended speed, but with other builds, there's the disadvantage of speed that I have to account for, where timing and precision is a lot more important. The game still does have build diversity, but doesn't cover combat like a blanket in the same way that Dark Souls 2 does, where any type of build in that game could work because the combat isn't as frantic. Ultimately though, this doesn't stop people from experimenting with different builds in Dark Souls 3, and again, you can still play the game however you wish. You just have more to keep in mind, considering the fact that the game is much faster in comparison to the other two. With magic, you get effective spells that can delete targets, strength you need to break poise, and as for dex, just use the Sellsword Twin Blades or the Lothric Knight Sword, apply a good gem to it, and it's easy Souls 3. Actually, using magic or miracles in general is easy Souls 3. Anyway, for far better build variety than vanilla Dark Souls 3, I would highly recommend checking out either the Cinders mod or the Convergence mod. I'll put links for both in the description. Despite some of the things I've said about the combat and the build variety, which is still there mind you, I personally love the combat in this game. Never has Dark Souls felt so good to play until 3. It makes Dark Souls 1 feel clunky and boring by comparison. The animations are much more smoother and the inclusion of weapon arts adds more to the existing combat itself. Parrying also feels really good too and is still pretty broken once you master it. Some of the bosses in this game like Gundyr and Pontiff Sullivan can be parried to death. And if you have the Uchigatana, you can even parry with the weapon itself, which is pretty sick. I used this parry technique to farm Lothric Knights in the castle after defeating the Dancer fairly early on. Speaking of which, the Dancer of the Boreal Valley is a boss that you fight much later on in the game, and it's one of the best fights in the game too. But you can actually fight it at the very beginning after killing Vort. You kill the woman who gives you the banner, and that triggers the boss early on. Killing Dancer gives you access to Lothric Castle early, and Titanite chunks to then net yourself an OP weapon to make the game really easy. But if you don't want to make it too easy, then just move on to the Undead Settlement and then go from there. Piggybacking to the combat itself, the weapons feel great to use. The ragdolling has returned, fixing Dark Souls 2's mistake for unnecessarily removing it. Lots of great enemies and bosses that all feel satisfying to fight. And in terms of boss content, the bosses are the best that this trilogy has to offer, better than anything in 1 and 2 combined. Even the worst bosses in this game still hold up better in comparison to the worst bosses in Dark Souls 1 and 2, because they still have some interesting mechanics to make up for it, as well as boss designs, except for the Ancient Wyvern. That fight is terrible. The boss quality is overall pretty consistent from beginning to end. Almost all of them are really fun to fight and have some amazing stage sets going for them. One of my favorite boss fights ever in the From Software game lineup is in the DLCs, and for me feels like the true final boss of Dark Souls 3, but that's ultimately up to interpretation. 2 has a lot of bosses with some in between being really good, but the rest are just like a mixed bag in terms of quality. 1 unfortunately falls into the same category after Anor Londo, with the DLC making up for it. But 3, including its DLCs, has a lot more great bosses than bad ones. It's overall just a solid and consistent experience all around with some small bumps along the way. Out of the 3, Dark Souls 3 is the best one in terms of boss content and overall combat. The NPCs are also another highlight of the game, with another onion, one that promises treasure, a familiar blacksmith, coupled with all the other NPCs you meet, makes Dark Souls 3 a mix of nostalgia and intrigue interwoven into the game's more connected and direct storyline. A lot have called it fan service, bringing back familiar faces. But because the story is wrapping up and the world is converging, it also means that people across time and history are also converging. This is made evident when you finally reach Irithyll and are faced with a surprising reveal when you reach a familiar elevator. The reveal culminates in the reveal that you've been in Anor Londo the entire time, a mere shadow of its former self. No longer the glistening, sun-ridden landscape that you saw in the first game, but now just a hollowed wasteland that has become a glorified graveyard. Even the giant blacksmith from 1 is dead. The game is ending. The series is ending. It's fitting that we see what was once before so that we can say goodbye to the world of Dark Souls and move on to the next adventure in a new world. But before that next adventure can begin, I'll quickly cover the PvP in this game. Once again, Covenants make a return, and it's functionally similar to the first and the second game. Some are co-op based, while others are geared towards PvPing. One of the Covenants, Rosaria's Fingers, actually enables you to respec your stats if you meet Rosaria herself. This is great for players that aren't enjoying their build and want to try something different this time. Like I've said before, PvP is something I've never really invested in much when it comes to the Souls games. I've had some experience with them overall, but that comes more from being invaded rather than making a conscious effort to engage in PvP and invade other people or duel in specific arenas. There is a PvP scene in this game, and it's a bit more active than in Dark Souls 2. But for the PvP itself, it's a bit more divisive this time around. 2's PvP, compounded with the already great build variety, made for a variety of unique PvP sessions due to its slower gameplay. But Dark Souls 3, on the other hand, has more of a focus towards faster gameplay, which by the way is really good, mind you, and when it works, the PvP is excellent. Ultimately, it just boils down to what you like the most about the PvP in general when it comes to the Souls games. In fact, the PvP in both 2 and 3 are great, for different reasons though. On the merit of the gameplay alone, the PvP in 3 is better, when it works, but the slower gameplay of 2 allows for much more build variety to be utilised. As much as I love 2 though, the gameplay is what ultimately wins me over with 3, and if I was a PvPer, I would be playing 3 more because of how much of an improvement the combat is overall, even in spite of some of the aspects regarding meta builds, as well as R1 spams and dex-based builds. And magic. Always magic. Dark Souls 3 is one of the best games I've ever played. The best game in the entire trilogy that has so much going for it. Fantastic gameplay, great callbacks to the first, the best bosses, combat that feels fast and satisfying, PvP that can be really fun, but somewhat hard to get into because of how many people have gotten good at it, tons of weapons and spells, armor sets to acquire, and linear but well-designed areas that have a ton of discoveries and some Easter eggs in between. While I dislike the lack of vibrant colors like in Dark Souls 1 and 2, the annoying delay attacks, the attacks after healing, as well as some annoying and bullshit areas to contend with, the good significantly outweighs the bad in Dark Souls 3. Playing from 1 to 2 is always a blast, but whenever I play 3, I'm reminded of how much more enjoyable 3 is overall. I'm glad that there won't be another Souls game. I think if there was ever a note to end things on, it would be here. We have a near-perfect sequel that wraps almost everything up nicely. Also, the final boss this time is finally fantastic, and the second phase will hit you immediately. Those that have played the first game will know what I'm talking about. I'm not showing the boss though, go play 3 and enjoy the experience yourself. Anyway, the last time I had a genuinely good feeling of finality towards a game was probably Halo 3 and Halo Reach. Dark Souls 3 was the next game to do this for me because it felt like the end of an era where things are coming to an end and we have to move on in order to make room for something new, but what we're left with are a bunch of, just great memories of absolutely fantastic experiences that have sort of helped shape our perspective on gaming as a whole. And that's what Dark Souls 3 is, a game about endings and new beginnings, making room for something else, closing the curtains and letting it go after something just can't carry on anymore. Well, thanks to modding though, we can actually continue the Dark Souls 3 train and keep things going and opening up the curtains. Because we have mods like Cinders, Convergence, and the Archthrones mod that looks absolutely amazing. The latter creates an entirely new experience with new areas with a ton of variety in design and style, and lots of new enemies and bosses. I'm looking forward to seeing its completion, but it's got a long way to go. Either way, I'll put a link for that mod too in the description for anyone interested. Definitely play Dark Souls 3, whether it's your first or you've just come up from Dark Souls 2 and get to rolling. Stay tuned and thank you for watching.